Hello friends, this is Sanjay. In this video series, we will cover the Interpretation of Statute subject from the LLB syllabus of Chaudhary Charan Singh University or CCSU, Meerut. The syllabus is common for both the 3-year and 5-year LLB programs, and the complete playlist is available on the LawMint YouTube channel. While I have covered all the topics that are specifically mentioned in the syllabus, I have also included some additional concepts and topics which are required for a better understanding of the subject and also helpful if you are preparing for any post-LLB exams like the CLAT PG, UGC NET or Judicial Services. The timestamps for the specific topics as per the syllabus are in the description below. This is part 3 and I will talk about the rules of statutory interpretation. In the previous parts of this series, I have covered the basics of statutes, the various types of statutes and situations when interpretation of statutes may be required. We also saw all the internal and external aids to interpretation. And in this part, we will cover all the important primary and secondary rules or principles of interpretation. To recap what we have previously discussed about the interpretation of statutes, if a statute is clear and unambiguous, it should be enforced or applied as is. If a statute is not clear or it has some ambiguity, that is where the need for construction or interpretation comes in. First of all, the primary rules for interpretation should be applied. If required, the secondary rules or principles of interpretation should be applied to fine-tune the interpretation that has been done by applying the primary rules. And the most appropriate interpretation of the statute should be implemented or enforced on the intended subjects of the statute. Also, the presumptions of statutory interpretation should be applied in each step of the interpretation process, and any interpretation that goes against the presumptions should be discarded. For example, the presumption of constitutionality, which is the presumption that the legislature cannot make any laws to intentionally violate the Constitution. So, any interpretation which seems to violate the Constitution will be a wrong interpretation and must be discarded. The literal rule means that the judges should interpret the law literally, based on the text or the words of the law, using the ordinary and plain meanings of the words. Over the years, the courts have set out some basic principles on how to use the literal rule. Every word in the statute should be given meaning, as no word is unnecessarily used, which means that the law should be read in its entirety. Selectively reading some parts and ignoring the other parts is not literal interpretation. One should not presume any omissions, and nothing should be added by the court, which means that the court should not assume that the legislators missed out something and try to supply that missing part. Whether something seems extra or something seems to be missing, the interpretation should be literal. Normally, all words and terms are interpreted as per their ordinary meanings. If any term used in the statute is supposed to have a special meaning, then the statute itself should specify the same. This is usually done in the definition section. Technical words are given ordinary technical meanings if the statute has not specified any other. It should not be assumed that the statute is implying something, leading to the judge introducing something extra into the statute. What is written should be interpreted as is. Words undergo shifts in meaning in the course of time, so the interpretation should be done on the basis of when the statute was written. For example, before the Industrial Revolution, the word manufacture meant made by hand, and it evolved from the Latin term manufactus. And now, manufacture means mass production, usually in a factory. So, while interpreting a statute which has this word manufacture, the date when the statute was written should be taken into consideration. And words acquire significance from their context. For example, if a statute is related to fashion or apparel, then the word clutch may refer to a woman's purse, whereas in a law related to automobiles, clutch will refer to a transmission component of a vehicle. And a consideration before applying the literal rule is that it should not be applied if it is leading to an absurd result or it is defeating the purpose of the statute. And if one of the parties is claiming that the words used in the statute actually mean something other than their normal meaning, then that party has to prove the same. First of all, the judge should try to interpret a statute literally. that is, based on the normal meanings of the words used. If such a literal interpretation is leading to an absurdity or a contradiction, then the golden rule must be used. The golden rule is where the judge will modify the meaning of the words in the statute to make the statute more practical and enforceable. For example, if there is a law which says that vehicles are not allowed inside a park, the word vehicle can refer to any device that is used for carrying or conveying persons or objects. So technically, not only cars or motor vehicles, but even bicycles, prams and roller skates are called vehicles. Since the literal interpretation will lead to an absurd outcome, the judge can use a golden rule to interpret the term vehicles. And the judge can decide that the word vehicle as used in this statute means motor vehicles, and therefore allow bicycles, prams and roller skates to be used inside the park. Now the golden rule has two approaches, a narrow approach and a wider approach. If the literal interpretation of the statute is too wide, like in this example where the literal interpretation of the word vehicle is becoming too wide to include things that were probably not intended by the legislature, then the judge can take a narrow approach and reduce the scope of the words used in the statute. Or if the literal interpretation is leading to an absurd outcome, then the court can take a wider interpretation to make the law more meaningful by increasing the scope of the words. The advantages of the golden rule are that it allows for flexibility, it allows for reasonable decisions, and it can avoid unintended outcomes. At the same time, a possible disadvantage is that the outcome of an interpretation is significantly influenced by the judge, because a lot of this interpretation process is left to the discretion of the judges. Also, there are no specific tests on when the golden rule can be applied and when it should not be applied. And sometimes the interpretation that is done using the golden rule may actually turn out to be different from what the legislature actually intended with the statute. The Mischief Rule or Hayden's Rule was first laid out in Hayden's case in 1584. So this is actually a very old rule of interpretation. A mischief means a wrong or a hardship that a statute is designed to remove or provide a remedy for. In simple words, laws are usually created to address an issue or to solve a problem of some sort. So the legislature is actually trying to address some issue through a statute. When a judge is constructing or interpreting a statute, he should first try to understand the true intent with which the law was created. That is, what was the mischief that was sought to be addressed, and interpret the law to make it effective. For example, if the speed limit in a school zone is 15 km per hour, then the mischief that is being addressed is that vehicles moving too fast can cause danger to the children in the school zone. So a judge can interpret the law to include even bicycles under the speed limit, because a person riding a bicycle at around 25 km per hour can crash into a school student and cause serious injury. So the judge is interpreting the law to ensure that the true intent of the law is met. Now the steps for using the mischief rule were laid down in Hayden's case, which are: first, the judge needs to understand what was the law before the specific statute was enacted. Second, what was the mischief or the problem that was sought to be addressed through the specific statute. Third, what are the details of the statute that has been enacted. And fourth, what is the true reason for the remedy, that is, the statute. Once the judge has the answer for all these four questions, he can then interpret the law to suppress the mischief, that is, to address the problem, and to advance the remedy. If there is an inconsistency or a conflict between two or more provisions of the same statute, or between the provisions of two different statutes, then the presumption is that the legislature would not have intentionally created such conflicting statutes. This is because it is also presumed that the legislature knows the state of the existing laws before it creates any new laws. Harmonious interpretation means that the courts should read such conflicting provisions in such a way that all of them are given effect and one statute does not end up overriding or negating the other. For example, you may have seen this sign outside banks stating that no firearms or weapons are allowed to be carried into the premises. Now, Article 25 of the Constitution guarantees the right to freedom of religion, and it says that carrying a kirpan is a part of the profession of the Sikh religion. So, when it is interpreted literally, the first rule, banning all weapons, is in direct conflict with the freedom of profession of the Sikh religion. Here, the court will interpret both the statutes harmoniously, such that this rule will apply on all persons except Sikhs who are carrying a ceremonial kirpan. In the Commissioner of Income Tax versus Hindustan Bulk Carriers case, the court also laid down the guidelines for using the rule of harmonious construction. First, the court must ascertain the intent of the legislature and give effect to it. The provisions should be read and interpreted in such a way that it reconciles them instead of making them contradictory. Similar to the first guideline, the court should adopt a construction that best serves the object of the statute. If one interpretation leads to an absurd result, while another interpretation gives better effect to the purpose of the statute, then the latter should be adopted, even if the former is grammatically better. If, despite harmonious construction, contradictions remain between the general and specific provisions, then the specific provisions should prevail over the general ones. The purposive approach to interpretation is quite easy to understand. The focus here is on the purpose of the statute. You will notice that there is a similarity with the Mischief Rule, where the focus was on the mischief that was intended to be addressed by the statute. In the purposive approach, the focus is on the purpose of the legislation, rather than just the literal meaning of the words. For example, the purpose of a law or a rule creating a pedestrian zone is to protect pedestrians. But interpreting the rule literally and saying that vehicles are never allowed to enter a pedestrian zone would cause undue hardship to any businesses who may have to transport their goods into their shops, which may be in the pedestrian zone. Using the purposive approach, the court can interpret this rule in such a way that the purpose of the rule, that is to protect pedestrians, is achieved, and at the same time injustice is not caused to any businesses in the pedestrian zone. The court can interpret the rule such that vehicles which have a specific reason to be in that zone are allowed, but only during such times when the number of pedestrians is very low, such as late in the night or early in the morning. If we compare the purposive approach with the golden rule, the focus here is to achieve the purpose of the law without modifying the words, whereas in the golden rule, the literal meaning of the words is altered to avoid absurdity or contradiction. The purposive approach is important because it is more flexible and more commonly used, whereas the golden rule is less flexible and not used so frequently. The rule of a reasonable construction can be explained and summarized in these 3 points. This is a principle where the courts aim to interpret laws in a way that is sensible and practical. It means interpreting laws in a way that makes sense in real-life situations and aligns with common sense. This approach helps to bridge the gap between strict legal language and the realities of everyday life. For example, suppose there is a statute which says that carrying any weapons, including sticks, is prohibited inside the building. Now, this man is carrying a stick that can be considered a weapon, and this should not be allowed inside the building, especially since there is no important reason for him to be carrying the stick. And at the same time, common sense tells us that this stick, the walking stick that is being carried by this old man, is less likely to be used as a weapon, and it is required for him to walk. So, rather than interpreting the law literally and banning all sticks, a reasonable construction allows the judge to interpret the law in such a way that it aligns with common sense, and the judge can decide what are the exceptions to the statute. Some of the advantages with this approach is that it is practical and flexible, whereas the disadvantage is that there is subjectivity, since it depends on the judge's interpretation of what is reasonable. Two important principles of interpretation that we need to understand together are beneficial and strict construction of statutes. There is a simple way to understand and remember these. Social welfare laws, labor laws, consumer protection laws, and environmental statutes which are all intended for the benefit, welfare or protection of the people, should be interpreted beneficially. The idea behind beneficial interpretation is to ensure that none of the intended beneficiaries of the statutes are excluded, even if the benefits are extended to those who may be on the borderline of the scope. The focus is on the intent or the purpose of the law, which is to extend benefits. If there is any doubt with the law, then the benefit of the doubt should go to the people. Tax laws, criminal or penal statutes, which can impose a burden or a punishment on the people, should be interpreted strictly. The idea here is that the scope should be strictly limited to what is clearly stated within the law. The judges should not extend the scope of the law to include situations, transactions or subjects that are not specifically stated. Here, the focus is on the literal text of the law. If there is a doubt, then the benefit of the doubt should go to the persons who are being taxed or the persons who are being accused. So, whether a statute is being constructed beneficially or strictly, the benefit of any doubts will always go to the people. Beneficial construction of statutes is typically used in interpretation of social welfare, labor, consumer protection, and environmental legislation. The main purpose of such legislations is the welfare of the people, to extend some benefits, or for the protection of people. Here, the statutes are interpreted in a way that the purpose of the legislations are fulfilled. The benefits or the protections are extended to all the intended subjects, even if such an interpretation is increasing the scope of the law. In other words, if there is a certain degree of doubt, then the benefit of the doubt should go to the people in question. If we look at this example case between the Employee State Insurance Corporation and Highland Coffee Works, there was a question about whether the employees of the said firm were covered by the ESI Act or not. Here, the court applied the principle of beneficial construction to interpret the ESI Act in such a way that the employees would be covered by it. This was done because the ESI Act is a social welfare legislation intended to protect the interests of the workers, and the benefit of any doubts should be in favor of the workers. Strict construction of statutes is also a very simple concept. In case of penal, criminal or taxation related statutes, they may impose a punishment, a hardship or a burden on the people. So such laws must be interpreted strictly so that only those situations or transactions that are specifically mentioned in the law are covered by it. In some landmark cases, the courts have ruled that criminal or penal statutes must be interpreted or constructed strictly in favor of the accused. And if there is an ambiguity in a taxation statute, it should be interpreted in favor of the taxpayer. As I have previously mentioned, if there is a doubt in a penal, criminal or taxation related statute, then the benefit of the doubt should go to the persons being taxed or the persons being accused under those statutes. With that, we have come to the end of this part. If you have any questions or feedback, post a comment below. Thank you for your like, share and subscription. I will see you soon in the next video. Take care and Jai Hind.